Hello folks, so today we're going to be taking a look at EK's new FLT flat reservoirs and their new tube reservoirs. So this is the lineup that we saw back in CES, that they're adding to their Quantum line, and they have actually been available to purchase for a little while now, and I've had these myself for a few weeks just so that I can get around to playing with them and seeing what they're actually like to work with. So chiefly the big change here is the move in a form factor from being the sort of traditional tubes like we've got on the left here to being the flat distro panel style reservoir that I use in a lot of my mods and that have become incredibly popular recently. So what EK is hoping to do here is engage in a different part of the market, and I think it's an interesting opportunity to try out something a little bit different. So as I mentioned, I've done a couple little builds behind the scenes just to kind of get a feel for how these reservoirs work. And we're going to be doing another one in a moment in the workshop just to see exactly how it's like in a more consumer-oriented chassis, because I was doing sort of open test bench stuff just to see exactly how things connect up and if there's any differences with the brackets and stuff. So first things first though, we're going to open one of these up and see what you get inside, and then we're going to analyze how they're actually made, because I think that's one of the most interesting things about these kind of reservoirs. So we've got two of the reservoirs out of their boxes here. The first one is the FL240, which is the volume version, and this one doesn't have a pump, it's just a pure reservoir. And then we've also got the 360mm version of the kinetic with the DDC pump mount. So these come with the pumps installed, or you can buy them separately without the pumps if you want to add your own later. So maybe if you've got a different housing or something that you want to use, or you already have one of the pumps and you just want the reservoir, you can actually just buy this unit by itself and fit it, because it will fit all the standard DDCs and D5s. Just make sure that they are legitimate ones and not knockoff copies, which sometimes have different dimensions. So inside the boxes, you get a bunch of different accessories for mounting them to your case. So you have the low C brackets and also the high C brackets. So these ones are primarily used for the volume and DDC versions, and then these ones are for the D5, because obviously D5s are much deeper than DDCs, and we'll be able to see that later on when we take one apart, and you're going to need a bit more space. So basically these U-shaped brackets allow you to attach these directly to a radiator mounting spot, or a radiator or fan mounting all around the case. And that makes them quite versatile, because not only do you have these, you also have screw mounts on the back. So these use M4 screws, so they're quite easy to use. You don't have any dodgy 632 madness you have to deal with like with the radiators. But you can then of course pair these things up with various other adapters that you might find. So if you have, for instance, the uni adapters that you need for using your regular pump reservoirs on mounts, you can use them with these. Alternatively, these will just fit directly onto 120mm fan spots. However, if you have 140mm fan spots, you may need an adapter, because not all of them have the 120mm spots in there as well. And I don't know if there might well be plans if these sell very well for 140mm versions in the future, but at present we're looking at the 120mm ones. Additionally, you get a handy little tool here. So this is basically like an Allen key, which has the notorious 9mm size on it, which is possibly the most annoying of all Allen key sizes, because no set seems to have it. My ones don't. I've got 4 different sets at home and none of them have a 9mm Allen key. So you're a bit out of luck if you don't have one of these. So I find this is quite convenient. Interesting to note, this is made out of injection molded plastic. And whilst normally I wouldn't want that, especially with these, you want a really high torque strength, this is actually going to be used primarily for tightening up fittings. So if you're going to be tightening up fittings, you don't really want that much torque. And actually the fact that this is made of plastic means that this is likely going to give way quite early on along the corners, which may actually protect the acrylic threads on the reservoirs themselves from over-torquing. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just be careful you don't over-torque too much in regular blocks, because actually this will break. Additionally, you also get a 2.5mm Allen key for use with these M4 threaded little screws. So these here also come with nuts and washers so that you can attach your brackets to all the various parts that you might need. So now's a good time to analyze how these are actually constructed, because this is the part that really works for me, because obviously I'm into CNC machining and I love making my own panels that are very similar to these. So how has EK gone about doing them themselves? So I think to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to take one of the 240mm ones, just because it has fewer screws than this, and we're going to take it apart. And I'm going to use the pump one specifically because there's a little bit more to talk to, because basically everything that applies to the pump reservoir is going to apply to the standard flat one. And then we can have a proper look at all the different parts inside the reservoir itself. So having taken apart the 240mm reservoir, we've got quite a few interesting little things that we can talk about here. So first up, really important to note, is we've got the D5 pump here. And this one comes with full sleeving. So this is the PWM version. And it's interesting to note that, of course, the DDC version doesn't come with any sleeving. So if this is going to be in a very visible area, then you may want to take that into account. So you're either going to have to do that yourself with with your own kit and kind of mod it yourself, or you're going to want to go for a D5 version. And what they've done is they've finished it up with heat shrink over here. So unfortunately it doesn't go into the housing, but this is probably the only way to be able to do it without actually messing up with the housing itself. The sleeving itself is a sort of a paracord type variety, so it's not the sort of PT sleeve that you may be hoping for, but that's no different to any of the other ones that I've seen to date so far. And of course you can always re-sleeve it yourself. We have a guide on how to sleeve into the pump housing as well, so if you want to go that one extra step further, you can do. So this pump is held into place by an acetal bracket. And this is a pretty standard kind of bracket. It's got nice counterbore holes. It's well machined from both sides. We've got internal, external chamfers, no sharp edges, good facing, everything's very nice and smooth, consistent machining marks. So that's nice to see, but at the end of the day, it's still a bracket. And as long as it functions, it does its job, that's enough. So moving to the actual reservoir body itself, and this is where the meat of the machining has been done. So it's basically comprised of one thick section and a much thinner lid. And the way that they've done it is they've got all the threads are in the thick section, along with the main volume of the fluid goes in here. And then they've completely left to the top unmachined. So the reason for this is they don't want to have machining marks all over the acrylic. Because obviously when you machine acrylic, it does leave marks. You can use very expensive special tooling to remove all of that, or you can use ones which mitigate it. But there are also difficulties with the kind of machine that you have. So even if you have a machine that's very kind of rigid and accurate, fantastic for doing metal cutting, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be very good for acrylic, because it may not spin at a high enough RPM. Your spindle is very important for trying to cut acrylic really clearly. So you need a high RPM spindle, and of course you need specialist tooling. So I use special acrylic cutting tooling. So even though I can't get a result as flat as this, I'll still get a very polished cut. But if you then took the same end mills that I use into one of these Haas machines, which is I'm pretty certain how that these are made, you're not going to get the same results, because it's the wrong sort of tooling for that particular machine process. So it's worth bearing that sort of thing in mind. So to get around this, they've decided to do only the machining on one half in terms of the volume, but this side is still machined. So as you can see, it follows a particular contour. And this is a really interesting point here. So you notice that they have these screw holes, which are countersunk M4, all going around the outside of the edge here, but there aren't any on this side. And that's because this particular cover here, which is made out of aluminium, this houses the LED strip on the inside, but it has a lip on here. And what happens is this lip meshes with the front panel like so. And when this is installed, there are screws on the back of this particular plate here that go all the way through on this side. And these basically screw all the way through and provide the seal on this. So if you were perhaps considering getting one of these reservoirs and you didn't want to use this, and you think, okay, maybe I'll just have the acrylic and I'll remove the frame, bear in mind, you're not going to have a proper seal on one side of the reservoir. So if you remove this, you run a massively kind of risk. In fact, I can pretty much guarantee that it will leak if you remove this. So I wouldn't do that if I were you. If you want to mod this, you can of course just take it off, it's just a few screws, and you can paint them. So I've seen a few people try painting them white and silver, and they do look really quite good. So that is always an option, and aluminium is quite easy to work with. You can use an etching primer and then just use some automotive paints, and it's quite simple. So turning our attention to the base of the reservoir, this is what we're presented with. It's not completely clear, and you'll see specifically that there is a snaking toolpath along the base. Now, I think they've done this for a couple reasons. So the first reason is, as I mentioned, unless you're using very specialist tooling like microcrystalline diamond cutters and things like that to be able to get a perfectly polished edge, you're always going to have machining marks. And actually they can be quite unsightly if your roughing strategy isn't a really aesthetic one. Now, the thing is, the most aesthetic kind of appearing roughing strategies aren't necessarily very efficient. And actually, if you're using something like an adaptive strategy, you're going to have weird lines all over the base, and then you have to come back with a finishing strategy anyway. So my hunch is that for this rear surface, EK has basically come in and done a sort of a snaking toolpath because they can add a consistent pattern that will have this particular toolpath always and look fairly similar across all the different SKUs, even if you have different levels of tool wear. So obviously, if you're cutting hundreds of reservoirs at a time, your tools are going to wear down, and being able to swap them out is obviously very important, but there will always be times where a tiny little bit of the aesthetic will be lost towards the end of a run. However, if you take measures like these, you can instead turn that into more of an aesthetic bonus, essentially. So it becomes a feature. So what they've done is they've taken this toolpath, gone along the backside, and it essentially means that even if the tool wear is slightly higher, it's always going to look pretty similar. And it's worth remembering that once you've put the coolant in here, most of these marks will all just disappear. Like, they become largely invisible. And I see this happen all the time with my own plates. If you see tiny little waviness between the different tool paths, actually as soon as you put the coolant in, it becomes almost completely crystal clear. Flatness is much more important at that point, and these should be plenty flat. So speaking of which, so they faced this whole side, left this side completely clear and untouched. And then one thing that definitely changes between these reservoirs and the plain volume ones is that you've got the pump mount on the inside. And this is one of the reasons I'm sure why these parts are so thick rather than being two similar ones as well. So this part here has the pump volute on the rear side. So the pump basically attaches to the inside over here and then goes through the other side, and you basically have plenty of different options. So one thing that I did notice when I was using these, of course, is you have to be very careful about which ports go where. So looking at this particular design, you can see that there's an inflow here, which comes from the volume of the reservoir itself. And that basically has to be used. You can also use an inflow down here, which runs into the reservoir, and there's another one on the front on this side over here, which we can see. These ones run into the main volume, and they will always go through this little hole that goes into the pump, and then will come out of this hole here. So this particular hole here is then accessed by a G1 quarter port on the underneath. So that's an outflow, visible over here. And then we have another outflow on the front. So it's these two ones in the middle that you have to use if you're going to be using this particular pump combo. If you're using one of these ones, then you can just use any of the available ports and any available orientation. So for that matter, it does mean you've got to be a little bit careful and mindful about how you mount this in your case. Because if you're going to be mounting it, for instance, sideways, you need to make sure that your fill port is going to be sort of at the top here, so it's actually easy to access it. Because if you mount it, for instance, this way around, that's going to be very difficult, and you're going to have to take your computer and you're going to have to like tip it up on its side or something to fill it and then put it back down again. So just bear that in mind, because you may, for instance, want to have this particular arrangement on the top or underneath. So if you're going to be doing that, always make sure that you take into account where the water is going to be going with your pump, because if your pump runs dry, that's no bueno, and it's not very good for the bearings at all. And if you leave it for a while, actually you can cause an awful lot of irreparable damage to the pump. So just bear that in mind, it's really quite important. So obviously I mentioned the mounting points and the different G1 quarter ports. These two ones on the bottom here are not as visible as you might think. So it's very easy almost to miss them when you're doing a build. So you'll take the ports out of the front and you'll put the reservoir in, and then it's only when you're doing a leak test, say with an air tester, or if you're just going through double checking everything, that you remember these ports here. So personally, I would have preferred it if these ports were actually blocked off on the bottom and the ones on the front were left open, because realistically, you're not going to leave these ones open if they're in plain view. These are quite often going to be presented down at the bottom like so. And once you've installed it, if you didn't notice that these were open, there's a good chance that all of your coolant is going to run straight out to the bottom and go all over your hardware. So just bear that in mind and be very, very thorough. Now, I mentioned the Rgb bracket, and of course this is a 5-volt addressable Rgb strip, and it runs all the way along the side of the reservoir. So this can go either to your motherboard or to a controller or splitter station, etc. So one of the things I did notice that I'm not necessarily so fond of with this particular implementation is actually this wire, although it feels very long, if you're working with a very large case, actually your controller or your motherboard may be nowhere near the reservoir. So you may have your reservoir right in the front of the case, and in which case you've got to train your wire all the way through. And actually this becomes quite short. So if you hold it sort of in a sort of typical place, and you go down, and then you have to go around, and you come back up, actually that's not very far. So you'd likely want to have an extension. So now extension cables are very easily found. You can get them on Amazon all over, and I think that EK has them in their web shop as well. But I think I would have preferred, however, if they used a short port down here and then supplied an extension with the reservoirs, mostly because actually once you've installed things and you've got the wires all kind of running around, if you need to remove something for any particular reason, having all the extra cables around does make it quite challenging. And I've had to do it only a couple times, but each time it's happened, it's been pretty painful. So I'd much rather just be able to disconnect something like that. And I feel the same way about all fans on the market. So all the ones which do not have tiny little kind of plugs down here, I also feel the same frustration with. So it's not just these products. This is just something I wish people would move to if they've got the option to. So additionally, one of the things that I also noticed when I was installing these is that whilst these brackets are very convenient, they are quite fiddly. So trying to install them in an arrangement like so means that you have to have your screws going in on the inside, or if you can always reverse it like that, but that doesn't look as good. So if you have them kind of going in there, you have to sort of mount it to the reservoir first, and then you have to mount it to your case. And actually trying to get your hands in behind the reservoir and things in some cases could be quite challenging. And especially so if you've decided to go for a slightly different arrangement. So for instance, a lot of the EK marketing has the reservoirs mounted flat like so underneath a graphics card, and trying to have your mounting solution sort of fit behind there is actually kind of difficult. And the other thing that's worth noticing is that you can't use these particular brackets for this mounting purpose without drilling into them, because they're sort of a U shape. So this means they're perfectly suited for attaching directly in this orientation. So you can put a bracket like so, and then it will sit flat. But if you do not have that particular arrangement, so say you're doing this angled one here, you'll notice if you tried using the brackets like so, there are no holes in it. So personally, I would have really liked it if they added just an extra hole just here and here, because I think that would have made it just a little bit easier to use in a few different scenarios. So I can see it being quite commonly used, so standing at a right angle. So for instance, because you've got this pump on the back here, you can't just jam it up against the radiator or a set of fans or a mount even, if there isn't a lot of clearance. So whilst these give you that clearance, sometimes you don't want to use all that extra room all around the case. So I'd have actually preferred it if these, by having an extra screw here, you could fit them to the side of a radiator mount very easily, just like so. So that would have eliminated the need to buy additional brackets that you can do to fit these properly. And I think it just would have made it a bit easier and cleaner, just with a single hole on the side. And they could even make it look nice, have a slot so you can move it up and down a little bit. But that's a small thing that you could easily mod that. The way I would do it is I would just drill 2 holes 105mm apart on this, put them where you want, and there you go. That's an easy mounting system. And actually drilling a bracket like this is quite easy. It's very low risk. So all in all, it's not that bad, but it would have been nice if that was their factory, I think. So now we've had a proper in-depth look at how they're constructed, I think it's about time that we went over to the workshop and popped one in a build. Right, so we've got ourselves a new Fractal R7XL case. That should do rather nicely for a beefy custom loop. Let's get going. So building into the Fractal R7XL, it was quite an interesting learning experience with how to mount one of these FLT 360 reservoirs. So we went with the D5 version, so that's the D5 Kinetic, and we've placed it underneath the graphics card because I think it's quite interesting having the reservoir down there, because that's usually quite a dead space. Usually, unless you have multiple graphics cards, it sort of has to be just left alone. And if you're not using a vertical arrangement, like we weren't here because we didn't have the riser cable and so on, it can be quite a barren part of the case. So I think this fills it up quite nicely, and it's one of the areas that I've seen used a few times recently with these reservoirs, including in some of the EK promotional material where they've stuck it underneath the GPU and done an interesting loop with that. So that's what we decided to do there. Another kind of point that we could have done is we could have put it in the front, maybe off one of the radiators. I didn't want to do that because actually the problem there is then the bottom half of the reservoir wouldn't have been visible, so I kind of wanted the whole thing to be in view, which I think looks nicer. Now we could have put it on the top as well, but the issue there is clearance. So this is a very thick radiator, so we've already used up most of our clearance in front of the motherboard, and it would have gotten in the way of tubes and things. So it's worth considering that maybe the top isn't the best mounting mechanism for these, especially for the D5 pump ones and the DDC pumps. But if you're using one of the plain ones, you could obviously put that on there. But then you're going to be able to have it, visible with like an offset underneath, and that might not look so great anyway. One thing that I had originally wanted to do was maybe have it facing the side window up near the front over here. Now, the problem with that arrangement actually mostly came down to clearance, just because we used such a thick radiator that actually the 360 didn't fit. But we could have gone for a smaller one, but I really wanted to fill the space up, so it didn't make much sense to do that. One thing that is a little bit tricky is obviously we have depth to these because we've got a pump underneath. So if you're trying to put it on the back, say next to the motherboard, it will have to stick out. And that's also going to raise a little bit of an issue with trying to mount it there. So we had this issue where, because we have the thick radiator in the front, we couldn't fit it onto the existing holes. So there are 105mm holes, which is fan spacing on this particular chassis, but we couldn't use that because our radiator configuration was a little bit too thick. Maybe it would work if we had a thinner one, so worth considering there, and other chassis will be laid out differently, so it might work. It would work particularly well if you're doing something like a Lianli 011D or something like that, where actually they've got a radiator mount there, so you've got a bit of depth behind it anyway, and you don't have anything forward which is going to get in the way of the pump mount, for instance. Except you may have to worry about radiators on the top and the bottom. That's the only thing you have to consider there. In terms of the RGB though, so we hadn't previously activated this, it's really quite impressive. So they've got a very quite dense RGB LED strip, so this is addressable RGB, and that runs along the side underneath the cover as we saw. And it really lights the whole thing up. So if you're going to be using a clear coolant, it goes right the way through. EK now has a sort of a milky type coolant, which isn't quite fully opaque, which is quite an interesting look. So that's the one that they had in their reservoirs at CES that you may remember. So we've just gone with some nice blue coolant, and it looks really good. In fact, it's bright enough that I didn't need to add any more LEDs to the case. It has still quite an understated look just because it's a nice kind of square shape, and it matches with this rather square case anyway. With the glass on, it does look rather good. The one issue I did have is that trying to mount it is a little bit tricky. So you'll see that in the video we drilled through the mounting plates. I didn't actually need to do that. I thought that was going to make things easier, but then I moved it around a little bit later on and found out that those holes didn't line up how I was expecting anyway. And then I just used a series of M3 screws and washers just to sort of put it around and secure it to the base. Now that's plenty strong enough for general day-to-day usage, but I wouldn't feel comfortable, for instance, shipping this in this particular arrangement. You'd probably want to mod the case and have it properly mounted in, but to me that's part of the thing of water cooling, modding, they're all sort of related, so I would actually recommend doing that and doing a proper job making it really secure. One thing also that I think I'd prefer is, you'll see we've got a port on the front here, there isn't one on the back. And despite the fact that we've got the pump on the back, meaning there has to be depth behind it, there aren't any ports on the back of these reservoirs, and so I would prefer if they had ports there, just because you could then maybe use it to connect up straight to a radiator perhaps, or use a different arrangement, because here we've got it quite near the front, and actually if it were a little bit further forwards, it probably wouldn't fit with this particular fitting, so we only just clear the glass on this one. If it went around the back, it would have been much easier to kind of plumb in. But aside from that, quite an easy process. Being so large, they did fill the loop up very quickly, despite the fact that this is a pretty big loop. We've got 2 thick radiators. That's a lot of coolant going in there. And it filled it up pretty fast. It bleeds pretty easily. This isn't an ideal setup just because we've got this fitting right at the top here, so a bit more air will be getting into the system, and this part here is a bit more redundant just because the coolant goes out a bit further up in the middle. But if you had it vertically, that wouldn't be a problem at all. And actually in some of the other setups that I tried out, I did do it vertically and it filled things up very quickly, and the systems did also bleed very, very quickly. So all in all, this is quite an interesting little bit of kit here. Now, I can think of quite a few cool ways that it can be used in a system that can make it a little bit different to the norm, especially compared with a tube reservoir. So I'm excited to see what other people can come up with. Of course, if you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe because we've got plenty more water cooling part reviews, modding project logs and tutorials just around the corner, and you wouldn't want to miss any of it. Of course, you can also find us over on our Discord server, linked below. Pop in, say hi, have a chat. And you can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, builds.gg and Twitter. Take care folks, and I'll catch you next time.